My father denied I was his until the test forced it, then demanded a son's portion of the estate. So I split it by the years he had claimed me, which came to nothing. Earl spent the first 20 years of my life swearing I was not his. When my mother put his name on the forms at the hospital, he had it struck off and told the nurses she was confused about who she had been with. He skipped my birthdays and crossed the street the few times we passed, and to anyone who asked, he called me another man's mistake. At my grandmother's funeral, he stood with his real family on one side of the grave and let me find a spot at the back among strangers. My mother took him to court when I was 12, and under oath, he swore he had barely known her. The judge ordered a test, and the results came back a wall of numbers that made me his beyond any argument. Earl paid the smallest support the law would allow, late and angry, for the years he could not escape. Proof did not make him claim me. The checks kept coming because a judge forced them, and the pretending kept on because no one could make him stop. He had 2 other children he called his own, who got his name and his Sundays and a seat at his table, while I got a check with no note and a father who looked through me at the store. My mother raised me on her own and never asked him for more than the court required. You do not need his name to be worth something, she told me, and she spent her life proving it. 2 jobs did not keep her from a single game or parent night. I remember her in the bleachers at every basketball game in middle school and every baseball game after that, sometimes still in her work clothes because she had come straight from her shift, clapping too loud and yelling my name, and I would pretend to be embarrassed, but I was not even a little, because she was the only one in those stands who was there for me, and she made it feel like enough. She left me a small house and what little she had saved when she passed, and I was 26 and suddenly on my own. Grief and a mortgage arrived together, and I learned fast that no one was coming to carry either. I sat at the table in that house with the bills spread out and my stomach in knots because the numbers did not work, and there was no one on the other end of the phone to tell me it would be okay. I almost lost that house twice in the first year. I ate cheap and picked up side work on weekends and figured it out because she had taught me that figuring it out was what you did when no one was coming to help. Work was the only inheritance I trusted, so I poured everything into it. I fixed up the house, borrowed against it, fixed up 2 more, and turned a trade into a company that put my name on trucks all over the county. That name, the one he had fought to keep off a birth form, ended up on signs all over town, and not one bit of it came from him. By 40, the business was worth more than Earl had earned in his whole life. Earl, meanwhile, watched the children he chose grow up and grow gone. The 2 he claimed moved away and stopped calling. His money thinned, and the family he had picked over me left him sitting alone. I built mine in the open while he lost his quietly, and for years, that was the whole of it. Then last spring, Earl found his way back to me, all warmth, calling me son for the first time in my life. He had heard about the business and what it was worth, and he had decided it was time we were family. The test made it official years ago, he said, so blood is blood, and a father has a claim on his son. He wanted a son's portion of the estate, the share he said any father was owed once the truth was on paper. He listed what he was due: a room in my house, a place in the company, a monthly sum, and a cut written into whatever I left behind. Already he had told his old friends that his successful son was bringing him in, and now he needed me to make the story true. When I brought up the court and the street and the check with no note, he waved it off as old business between grown people. You came out fine, he said, so no harm was done, and now you can do right by your father. Doing right, in his mouth, meant money, since a father was a thing he became only when there was an estate to share. His other 2 had bled him dry and vanished, and he needed a son who had money, and the paper said that son was me. Not once did he say sorry, or my name, or anything that was not a number with his hand out beneath it. For a few weeks I let him call, and some part of me, the kid at the store, still wanted the word son to mean something. What that kid wanted and what Earl was offering were not the same thing, and I made myself see the difference. He was not asking to be my father. He was asking to be paid like one, decades after the job had gone unfilled. The first call I made was to Janet. She had been my mother's closest friend, the kind of woman who showed up with food before you knew you were hungry and told you the truth before you were ready to hear it. She knew Diane better than anyone alive, and she knew what Earl had put her through. I told her everything: the calls, the word son, the list of what he thought he was owed. For a moment, Janet did not say anything, and then she said, "Your mama would roll over. Don't you give that man a dime." I told her I was not planning on it, but that I needed to think through how to handle it the right way. Then Janet said something that stopped me cold. Did I know he told people my mother had trapped him? Years ago, before the court even ordered that test, Earl had told a neighbor on his street that Diane had gotten pregnant on purpose to lock him down, and that the baby probably was not even his. My mother had never told me that. She had carried that lie like a bag of rocks and never set it down in front of me, because she did not want me to hate him more than I already had reason to. Hearing it now, years after she was gone, did something to me. Whatever soft part was still listening when Earl said son on the phone went hard and quiet. He had not just walked away from me, he had tried to make her the villain for having me at all. The next morning I called my lawyer. I laid the whole thing out in his office, the calls, the demands, the way Earl was already telling people he was coming on board. When I was done, I asked him straight whether Earl had any legal claim to anything I owned. The lawyer leaned back and said that in this state, a parent who willfully avoided support and acknowledgement of a child has no standing to claim from that adult child's estate. He denied me for 20 years, fought the test, and paid the bare minimum only because a judge held his feet to the fire. Morally or legally, the lawyer said he had nothing. Then he added that it would not stop Earl from making noise. Men like him do not need a case, they just need a story. And right now, he was writing one where I was the bad guy. I told him I understood, and I told him I was not going to hide from it. I was going to give Earl exactly the portion a father had earned from me, a son's portion. But I was going to calculate that portion the only honest way, by the years Earl had actually claimed me as his son. Not the years the court forced him to pay, not the years a piece of paper said we shared blood, the years he chose, on his own, to call me his. I already knew what that number was. I went home and started pulling the records together. My mother had kept everything, careful and quiet and ready for the day the truth might need proof. I found the court transcripts from when I was 12, Earl swearing under oath he barely knew her. I found the payment records showing checks that came weeks weeks late every single time, with no note, nothing personal at all. I found my birth certificate, the original with his name on it, and the version where he had it struck off. Every piece of paper was a year he chose to be a stranger. Every folder was a door he closed on purpose. I spread it all out on the table, and it felt like looking at a map of every time I was not enough for him to show up. Then, stuck inside the court file my mother had kept in a manila envelope at the bottom of the box, I found something I had never seen before. A letter in her handwriting, the kind with the big loops on the Y's, addressed to Earl, but never sent. Inside, she had written just a few lines. He looks just like you, and you know it. One day he will be something, and you will wish you had been there. I read it 3 times and then set it down and just sat there. The house was quiet. The clock in the hall ticked the way it always did. For a while, I was not a man with a company and trucks and property. I was her son, sitting in her house, hearing her voice from a place I could not reach. She had known Earl would come back one day, not because he missed me, but because I would build something worth coming back for. She had written it down before I was old enough to tie my shoes, sealed it, and carried it alongside the court papers like a counter-argument she had prepared in advance. The court papers were proof of what Earl had done. Her letter was proof of what she had always believed. I was not doing this just for me anymore. I was doing it for every night she worked a double and came home smiling, for every time she sat in those bleachers by herself and cheered loud enough for 2. Earl did not get to collect on work she did alone. While I was putting the records together, Earl was not sitting still. A colleague called to tell me Earl had been at the diner buying coffee for people and saying his son had come around, that they were working things out. He used the word partner and talked about how blood always wins in the end. He was spending credibility he did not have, writing checks with my name on them I had never signed. People talk, stories stick, and Earl knew that if he told his loud enough and long enough, folks would start to believe he had always been part of this. A few days later, he stopped waiting for phone calls and came to the office himself. I was in a meeting when staff knocked and said there was someone in the lobby asking for me. When I walked out, Earl was sitting in one of the chairs by the front desk like he had been coming there for years, talking to the receptionist in the warm voice he had been using on me, shaking hands with employees who happened to walk through. I heard him say my boy's company loud enough for the whole room to catch it. He was introducing himself as the father, like the word carried weight when it came from his mouth. I walked over and did not smile. I said, "Earl, come with me," and led him down the hall to a side room and closed the door. He was wearing a pressed shirt and looked pleased with himself, like showing up here was a smart move, and I should be impressed by his nerve. I looked at him standing there in my building, in a room I had built and paid for, surrounded by a business that carried my name because I had earned the right to put it there, and I felt nothing that resembled a welcome. I said, "You do not work here. You do not own anything here. Do not come back." The warmth left his face like a switch had been flipped. What was underneath was not sad or hurt. It was hard. His eyes went flat and his mouth pressed thin, and the friendly old man from the lobby was gone. In his place was the same Earl who had told a courtroom he barely knew my mother. "After everything I gave you," he said, "this is how you treat your father?" I said, "What did you give me, Earl? Name one thing." He opened his mouth and nothing came out. He tried again and still nothing. He had nothing because there was nothing to name. No birthday, no ride to school, no talk on the porch, no dollar that did not have a court order behind it. He fell back on the only card he had ever played. "Blood is blood," he said, like that phrase was a key that opened every lock. I told him to leave. He stood slowly, like he wanted me to feel the weight of him going, and walked out the front door without looking at anyone. That night, Janet called and told me Earl had been at the hardware store telling people I was refusing to take care of my elderly father, that I was keeping him out while sitting on a pile of money he had helped me build, and that he might have to get the law involved because his own son was neglecting him. She said, "He's building a story and he's building it fast. You need to get ahead of this." I called the lawyer back. I told him what Earl was doing, the diner, the office visit, the stories at the hardware store. I said I wanted a formal meeting in his office, documented, with him in the room. The lawyer did not hesitate. He said to bring everything and they would sit Earl down and show him exactly what that math looked like. 2 days later, my phone rang with a number I did not know. It was Dwayne, my half-brother, the one who got the name and the Sundays and the seat at the table. I had spoken to him maybe 3 times in my entire life. He sounded like a man reading off a card. "Dad says there's enough for all of us," he said, "and I think we should sit down as a family." I could hear something in the background, a voice just far enough from the phone to be blurry, but close enough to be obvious. Earl was there, feeding Dwayne the words like a prompter behind a curtain, not bothering to step away or lower his voice. He did not put his hand over the receiver or move to another room. He just let me hear it, like it did not matter, like this arrangement was normal. I said, "You moved away and stopped calling him. Now you want to sit down as family?" The line went quiet. Then Dwayne said, "He's still our father." The word "our" made my jaw tight because it had never been true. There was no "our" when it came to Earl. There was his, and there was the one he threw away. I kept my voice level and said, "He was yours, Dwayne. He was never mine." Dwayne did not relay whatever Earl was hissing in the background. He just said, "All right then," and the call ended. A few hours later, he sent a text saying Allison, the half-sister, wanted nothing to do with Earl and nothing to do with me either. She was not picking a side. She was picking the exit. It told me more than the phone call had. Even the children Earl had chosen did not want him. Dwayne was calling because Earl was standing over his shoulder making him do it. Allison had already run. The family Earl had built by choosing those two over me had dissolved in his hands, and now he was down to the last name on his list. The one he had denied, the one he crossed the street to avoid. I was not his first choice or his second. I was what was left after everyone else walked away. Earl did not want a son. He wanted a bank account with a pulse. I went through the records one final time and built a chart on a clean sheet of paper with a ruler and a pen. 40 years of my life, 2 columns. Every year from 0 to 40 on the left. On the right, 2 categories. Years. Earl denied me. 0 through 20. 2 decades of being told I did not belong to him. Of watching him cross the street. Of hearing through other people that I was another man's mistake. Years Earl was forced to pay support. 12 through 18. 6 years of checks a judge forced out of his hands. Then 2 lines at the bottom. Years Earl claimed me voluntarily. 0. Years Earl acted as a father. 0. I looked at that that chart for a long time. The math was clean and it was devastating. A son's portion of anything multiplied by 0 years of fatherhood equals nothing. That was the number. That was what he had earned. I put the chart in the folder with everything else and closed it. The morning of the meeting, Earl called early. The warmth was gone. What was left was hard and impatient. The voice of a man tired of waiting for what he believed he was owed. "I hope you've come to your senses," he said. "A father shouldn't have to beg." I stood in the hallway with the folder on the counter behind me and my mother's letter inside it, and I said, "Come to the lawyer's office at 2. I'll have your portion ready." There was a pause, and then his voice came back lighter, almost pleased, like he had won something. "That's more like it," he said, and hung up without saying goodbye. He had no idea what was waiting for him. Earl walked into the lawyer's office at 10 minutes before 2, wearing a pressed shirt and a face that looked like payday. He brought Dwayne, who came in behind him like a man being pulled by a rope he did not want to hold. Dwayne sat in a chair in the corner and did not say hello. The lawyer stood, shook hands, and seated everyone at the table. He said the meeting was being recorded for documentation purposes, and Earl nodded like this was just business between men. I sat across from Earl and placed the folder on the table between us. His eyes went to it and stayed. I opened it and did not raise my voice. I said, "You asked for a son's portion. I think that's fair." Earl leaned forward and I could see it, the almost smile, the look of a man who believed he had finally gotten through. I pulled out the first document and laid it flat on the table. My original birth certificate. His name struck off. I said, "This is the day you told the hospital I was not yours." His smile tightened but held. He kept his hands folded like he was waiting for the real part to start. I pulled out the court transcript from when I was 12, the one where he swore under oath he barely knew my mother. I placed it beside the birth certificate. "This is you saying I did not exist." Earl shifted in his seat. "That was a long time ago," he said. I looked at him and said, "I know. I counted every year." Then I kept going. Document by document, I laid out the full timeline. The birthdays he skipped, the streets he crossed to avoid me, my grandmother's funeral, where I stood at the back among strangers while he stood with his real family on the other side of the grave, the support checks that came late every single time, each one arriving with no note and no name, no birthday wish, no "Are you doing all right?" Just a number on a slip of paper because a judge had made it impossible not to send one. Each page I laid down was a year of his life he had chosen to spend elsewhere. Each year was a door he closed on his own. The lawyer sat still beside me, watching Earl's face change. It went from expecting to stiff to something pale and tight around the mouth, like a man watching a door close that he thought would stay open forever. Dwayne stared at the table and did not move. I placed the final sheet down, the chart, 40 years, 2 columns. I read it out loud so there was no confusion. "Years you claimed me voluntarily, 0. Years you acted as my father, 0. A son's portion, divided by 0 years of fatherhood, comes to nothing." I slid the paper across the table until it sat in front of him. "That's your share. That is what you earned." Earl stared at the paper. His mouth opened and closed and nothing came out. And for the first time in my entire life, the man had nothing to say. The room held that quiet for a long time. Then his voice came out low and shaking. "I'm your father. The test says so." I said, "The test says you're the man who got my mother pregnant. My mother was my father. She was both. You were just a check the court made you write." Earl turned toward Dwayne, looking for backup, for anything. Dwayne pushed his chair back, stood up and said, "I shouldn't have come." He walked out and the door clicked shut behind him. Earl was alone. Just him and the math of his own absence spread across the table. The lawyer spoke then, calm and clear, the way a man speaks when the facts do all the work. He told Earl he had no legal claim to any part of my estate. He told him the documentation showed a clear pattern of willful denial and abandonment. He told him that if he continued making public claims about the business or my obligations, they would pursue a cease and desist. Earl's hands were shaking on the table. He looked at me and said, "You owe me something." I stood up and picked up the folder. I thought about the kid who stood at the back of that funeral. I thought about the checks with no note. I thought about the letter sealed in a manila envelope at the bottom of a box, a letter she never sent because there was no version of Earl that would have read it and understood. I said, "I owed you a chance to hear the truth. That's done now." I walked out of that room and did not look back. Earl did not call again. The story he had been building around town fell apart on its own once Dwayne told Allison and Allison told someone. Earl's version collapsed without anyone from my side having to correct a word of it. I did not need to. The math spoke for itself, the same way it always had, the same way my mother always said it would. Janet called that evening. I said I thought I would feel more. She said, "That's because you already did your grieving. Your mama made sure of that." I thanked her and hung up. I walked through the house to a cabinet door that had been sticking for weeks and started fixing it. The tool was in my hand before I decided to pick it up.